My pleasure to welcome back to the stage Alan White.
All right, well, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Pierre Lemont. And he'll speak to the topic of the age of uncertainty. If there ever was a time of uncertainty in our world, I think it's now. And the consequences of the uncertainty, of course, none of us can fully grasp, but socially, economically, environmentally, and certainly in the markets, uncertainty abounds. So our talk is timely. One might even say urgent. Pierre is the global deputy CEO of Ipsos and CEO of the North American operation. Ipsos is the third largest market research firm in the world, I believe. So I have that right? Thank you. And it is staff of over 17,000 worldwide, with about 2,000 in the US. It's listed on the Paris Stock Exchange, and it has built a very large and thriving business over many years in the areas of media, advertising research to understand customer experience, to support market strategy and sales forecasting, and research concerning corporate reputation and its significance for business and investment. Pierre today will talk about the main drivers behind, quote, a new normal in the world, and why the understanding of this landscape is important for both investment leaders and business leaders. So, Pierre, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Daryl, Mark, all the great people at CECP. As you mentioned, we at Ipsos are engaged in a very wide variety of research topics. And we work for a very broad base of clients, governments all around the world. But the one thing that unifies everything we do is really to try to understand the why behind people's behavior. As you talked about our scale, we do operate in multiple markets, which gives us this vantage point of being able to track the public opinion, not just only over time, but also across different countries and see some patterns. One thing that we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years in the Western world is that the public opinion is increasingly dominated by anxiety and fear. And of course, this has culminated in a few high-profile votes, the Brexit, the election of Donald Trump. But even more broadly, increasingly we feel that it's getting harder to use past behavior to predict the future, right? So that's what we call the age of uncertainty. Now, one of the ways this all manifests itself is in the fact that the lines between the worlds of politics, religion, society, entertainment, and commerce are increasingly disappearing, right? And as they increasingly disappear, we get to these situations where things can get pretty quickly out of control. They get out of control for brands, for companies, for people, for leaders, as we've seen in multiple examples. But on the flip side, savvy political entrepreneurs are also able to leverage the public's beliefs, ideals, values to influence consumers' behavior. So, of course, a number of people would think this is a temporary phenomenon, right? So right now, we have someone shaking up the system, but in 2 years from now, we're done with the experiment, or maybe 6 years. And so are we going to return to the regular order, to use the Senator McCain, one of his favorite expressions? By the way, his own funeral were not exactly a very good example of return to the regular order. But in a way, if you think of for instance, the last elections in Sweden, the far right did not win. The British are sort of trying to exit from the Brexit without saying it. I'm French, right? So that's the way I see it. And here, the Democrats have a good shot at winning back the House at the next midterms election, and then maybe put a check on the president. Maybe. We'll see that. But no, we don't think this is happening. And the reason why we don't think this is happening is because many of the trends that we're observing, especially the profound deep trends, are related to or very much driven by generation replacement, right? So this is not going to go away. The young generation do not think, do not act as their predecessors. And so at Ipsos, we think that underlying this age of uncertainty are three broad-based, long-term social trends. And the first of them is this concept of erosion of trust. And by erosion of trust, we mean, in fact, trust in absolutely everything. So part of that is interpersonal trust, the trust I have in my neighbors, the trust I have in my community, the trust I have in the people I do business with, which, by the way, makes the business increasingly expansive. All this is going down. But more importantly to what we're talking about today is the trust in institutions, which is clearly going down. And so some data here. At Ipsos, we track the trust that the public has in a basket of 13 institutions. That's for the US, institutions ranging from financial institutions, corporations, labor unions, religious authorities, media, TV, press, whatever, the Supreme Court, Congress. And what you can see over the last 4 decades, so it's a long-term trend here, the trust in these institutions has gone down by about 10 points, which is a very considerable number. And by the way, right before the election of Donald Trump, we ran one of our global studies, and we asked people what they thought about society. In the US, you can see that 2/3 of Americans back then were thinking that the society is broken. Even more, 70%, that the economy is rigged in favor of the rich and powerful. And almost the same number that we needed a strong leader to take us back. Of course, it was right before the election, so things were a little bit exacerbated, but we're seeing the same phenomenon in many other countries, especially in the West. Sorry, it's a little bit slow to move. Behind this idea of the strongman syndrome, right, it's a very simple thought process here. If our country is so rich and prosperous, and we see this in the press, in data every day, right? Stock markets hit new records every week almost. We're seeing a long streak of growth in this country. So things seem to be going pretty well. Unemployment is low, at least in the numbers. So why is it that so many people, including myself, not me, but I'm putting myself in the shoes of people thinking this way, are not doing so well and are struggling so much? Well, the reason for that is because, well, obviously the system must be rigged, which means that the establishment, that is, well, what we represent in this room, the establishment no longer cares about people like me. They care about themselves. They care about people who are like them. So what do we need? We need a strong leader who's going to finally take care of us. And the way we identify this leader is that they speak, or he speaks, or she speaks the same language with the same words, uses the same symbols, and acts in a similar way as I do. So that's the strongman syndrome. The second long-term trend that we're seeing is this idea of ideological tribalism, right? So people have always assembled in groups, right? People who went to similar schools, people who live in the same neighborhood. But increasingly what we're seeing is that these tribes are centered around shared sets of beliefs, of values, of ideals, right? And by the way, just something I want to say up front, there's a misconception, especially outside of the US, by the way, about America being increasingly conservative. This is actually not true. America is getting increasingly socially liberal. There's a question that we use at Ipsos to sort of as a proxy to assess the degree of tolerance of a society. And the question is, should a homosexual be allowed to teach in a college or university? 40 years ago, a majority of Americans believed that no, we should not let a homosexual teach in a college or university. Today, we're close to 90%, actually over 90% for the youngest generation. So in total, the country is getting more and more socially liberal and more tolerant. But what this is hiding is the fact that on the flip side, there's an increased polarization in the beliefs of people, right? And that polarization, for instance, translates very well in that question of pro-life, pro-choice, right? Who favors abortion? Again, until the 80s, that was not a very discriminant question between Democrats and Republicans. People thought about the same about that. But over the last 10, 20 years, especially last 10 years, we're seeing that bigger divide, right? So a vast majority of Democrats believe that abortion should be allowed. A significantly lower percentage of Republicans do think that abortion should be allowed, right? And of course, as you could expect, independents are in the middle. So a pretty huge polarization here. But it's not just about the beliefs. It's also about the way people live and their life experience, right? So for instance, if you're a Democrat, well, you have more chances to listen to your NPR podcast after having run some errands at Whole Foods, buy some organic food, and then you watch your Manchester United game on your streaming service. If you're a Republican, you have more chances to drive back to your farm in your pickup truck, watch some baseball or NASCAR. I didn't make this up. This is statistical. So you see this increased polarization of beliefs and also behaviors of the lifestyles is the bedrock of something called hot cognition. And what is hot cognition? Hot cognition is a simple concept coming from behavioral science. It basically states that people are as lazy as they can when it comes to making decisions or forming an opinion. And so if you can trigger the right cues, you can fairly easily influence their behavior, especially if the opinion is already very polarized. So we demonstrated this in a little experiment that we run at Ipsos. We asked people in the US whether they supported the repeal of the 1975 Public Affairs Act. So I don't think that any of you knows what the 1975 Public Affairs Act, because it doesn't exist. We just made it up, just made this up. So you would expect people to say, well, I don't know, I can't say if I repeal it or not, because I don't know what it is. So what we did is we split the sample, so the respondents, in 5 groups. To some of them we said, well, the repeal is endorsed by Trump. To some of them, the repeal is endorsed by Republicans or by people or by Democrats or by Hillary Clinton. And guess what happened? When you ask Republicans, are you in favor of repealing the 1975 Public Affairs Act? Trump supports it. Yeah, it's a very bad act. Let's get rid of it. If you tell them, well, Democrats support it. Oh, no, it's a great act. We have to keep the 1975 Public Affairs Act. Interestingly, by the way, if you look at people, Republicans tend to find it a little bit more convincing than Democrats, which maybe is food for thought as well. So that was for the tribalization. Then the third trend here, which in fact exacerbates in a way the second one, is this end of the white majority. And if you look at the data here, it's true that by 2060, the so-called white non-Hispanic ethnicity will represent less than half of the US. And you can already see this, of course, in kindergartens, right, across the country. So what happens then, and we've observed that, it's well documented in many, especially in many Western European countries, when this is happening, when this question of identity comes up, then that creates a lot of anxiety and resentment among the people who are struggling, And interestingly, there's nothing that today differentiates more Republican from a Democrat than 2 things. The one thing is the trust in the media, okay? The other one is this question of race and identity. It's very striking. The differences are huge. For instance, 72% of Democrats believe that black people do not have the same opportunities than white, the same as white in this country. Only 24% of Republicans believe that. Conversely, 2/3 of Republicans believe that social policies such as affirmative action discriminate white are unfairly discriminating white people when you only have less than a quarter of Democrats who think that. Those differences are very, very significant, especially when it comes to not behavior, but beliefs. So what are the implications of these 3 trends? Again, lack of trust or erosion of trust, increased tribalism based on ideologies, and then the third one is this demographic shift, which exacerbates the other ones. One of the big implications here is that it's really difficult, increasingly difficult to reach consensus. And that's hard to accept, right? Especially for people like us who've been sort of trained to reach consensus as leaders, right? We want people to agree. We want to make sure that everybody's will be broad, unifying. But it's getting very, very difficult. And as an example of that, to the very essential question of what is being a real American. What's a real American? Well, the country is very divided. For 27% of Republicans, someone who does not stand for the national anthem is not a real American. Of course, that's because of the increased polarization, the press, the media, Trump's, and everything. But still, only 27%. It's crazy. 61% of Democrats, on the other hand, have no issue with that. Conversely, 25% of Democrats believe that someone who believes that immigration should be restricted is not a real American, although restriction or some restriction seems to be kind of a logical thing to do, right, at one point. But still, only 25% of Democrats believe that someone who thinks this way is a real American. And then, of course, on the flip side, 68% of Republicans don't have a problem with it. So this big divide and this very, people jumping on their guns when you talk about certain topics creates that situation of very unanticipated reactions. And of course, we talk a little bit about how you can try and avoid that if you want to avoid it. But more importantly, you have to get prepared. This is going to happen, right? So you need to wonder, if this is happening to me, if things get out of control, how will my organization react quickly enough to counter that one way or another? Some companies actually play with this now, of course, as we've seen in recent examples. But if you play with it, then it's not unanticipated, and you have to assume that they know what they're doing. Second thing is, you have to be very careful these days, very, very careful. And by the way, this is true for external messages, but also internal messages inside your own companies, with your friends, with your communities. Make sure you know where you step, right? So one thing here is to understand and remember that New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, DC, where most decisions are made, is not exactly representative from the American, the American public and America in general. That's one thing. But also, you have to understand if your target is red, blue, purple, right? If your messages intend to be red, blue, purple, if your initiatives, if your advertising, same as messages maybe, is going to be perceived as red, blue, or purple. You need to understand that, because if you don't, then you're really playing with fire. And I'll finish on that. There are, we used to say at Ipsos, we are used to say at Ipsos that America is a cognitive minefield. So there are words, expressions, concepts, symbols that are going to make you sound like you're on a certain camp. And if you do that, you are going to most likely alienate the other side, right? So that's going to happen. For instance, Black Lives Matter, feminists, activists, LGBTQ, never again, public policy experts, etc. Even the Silicon Valley is going to make you sound like you're blue, right? On the other side, if you speak about patriotic, Ronald Reagan, the Second Amendment, obviously, but even Fortune 500 CEOs, which is different from a concept standpoint from the Silicon Valley, right? That is going to make you sound, on the other side, more Republican. So I'm not saying you should not use them, but if you do, again, understand your target, know what you're doing, right? On the flip side, there are some very unifying concepts still. And the good news, by the way, is that those concepts are not only more unifying, but also more favored in general by the public. So it's not just that they're less divisive, it's also that in general, they are liked concepts, right? And they often go back to the roots of the American experiment, such as responsibility, entrepreneurs, being self-reliant, being independent, taking care of others, taking care of future generations, all these things, the First Amendment, all these things are very unifying and things that are not going to put you in a bad situation that you can't control. So that's all I wanted to tell you today. I hope I stimulated a little bit your thinking. I'll be here for the reception with two of my colleagues, so we can talk further if you wish so. I wish you the best and hope you can find your own way in this age of uncertainty.